Let us now proceed to the different kinds of poems. The first one is sheet. Sheet poems are composed of couplets. They are poems of two more coupled lines. The two lines of couplet usually rhyme and match rhythmically and complement each other tonally. Modern Mandarin only has 5 tones, but ancient languages usually had more, so the tonal rhythms are generally lost. This is the example of the poem She. The next one is Si. Si poetry can be described as poems that have patterns of syllables and tonal patterns. In making a Si poetry, a poet chooses words that fit a specific pattern. These patterns may have once been part of a song, but the music has been lost. There are various patterns that provide effective settings for various effects or moods. The third one is Je. The word Je means song. Je poems are the words to a song that can be sung. There were folk songs as well as songs composed by the literate and educated composers. The fourth one is Chu. When the Mongols conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty, they brought with them their own style of music and forms of entertainment. The songs from the operas and popular songs were a poetic style called Chu that was also popular in later eras. The poetic style is free of form. The last one is Fu. A fifth major style of poetry is called Fu. These are descriptive poems that contain both prose and couplets. These were popular about 1,500 years ago to 2,000 years ago. Often poets included rare or unusual written characters from preceding eras in their poems. This is the example of Fu. Let us now proceed to the Chinese poet in Chinese literature. Chinese poetry has been a favorite literary genre for thousands of years. Poetry isn't taken very seriously in the West, especially in the last 200 years. But Chinese ancient poetry is still read and ancient Chinese poets are honored. The very ancient poetry that was written 1,000 or more years ago was simpler and about common things like love, romance, and nature that people appreciate. Though much poetry was written in the eras following the Song dynasty, it is thought that the poets became increasingly erudite, academic, and esoteric so that modern Chinese can appreciate the style and meaning. Since the Chinese have a character-based writing system instead of an alphabetic system, though the languages have changed, modern Chinese can still read a lot of the ancient poetry. Since the pronunciation of words has changed a lot, often the rhymes or tonal rhythms are lost for poems that rhymed or had tonal patterns. But the meaning of the characters haven't changed much, though modern readers may interpret the words to mean something other than the ancient author intended. Nuances and connotations may be lost. Since old poems remain and modern Chinese can understand them to some extent, they are still appreciated. Here are some famous Chinese poets in Chinese literature. The first one is Chu Yuan. The second one is Ruan Ji. And the third one is Shi Lingyun. Let us first discuss who is Chu Yuan. Chu Yuan was a Chinese patriotic poet from southern Chu during the Warring States period. Chu Yuan is considered the first prominent Chinese poet. 25 of his poems are found in an anthology of poetry known as Chu Si. Chu Yuan is also regarded as one of the most prominent figures of Romanticism in Chinese literature, and his masterpieces influenced some of the greatest Romanticist poets in Tang Dynasty, such as Li Bai and Du Fu. Li Bai and Du Fu is also famous poets during this time. Some of his poetry are expressing his fervent love for his state and his deep concern for its future. His famous work is Li Sao, which means encountering sorrow. The Li Sao begins with the poet's introduction to himself, and some references to his current situation, and then proceeds to recount the poet's fantastical, physical, and spiritual trip across the landscapes of ancient China, real and mythological. Li Sao is a seminal work in the large Chinese tradition of landscape and travel literature. Also, Li Sao is a political allegory in which the poet laments that his own righteousness, purity, and honor are unappreciated and go unused in a corrupt world. The poet alludes to being slandered by enemies and being rejected by the king he served. Since the poem was a long poem that has 1,000 and more words, I stated only the epilogue of the poem. Li Sao is still Chu's best-known work, a paean of selfishness and duty. The line is held as proof of Chu's loyalty to the needs of the people. That's what means in modern Chinese, but in classical texts, this character mostly refers to the noble classes. By stepping into the waters of the Milu, Chu Yuan became a beacon for those striving for a better world and an idol to those running from a bad one. In a history as long and muddied with confusions as China's, he has never ceased to serve. Let us now proceed to the second poet, Ruan Ji. Ruan Ji was an eccentric 3rd century Chinese poet and one of the famous 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove. 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove is a group of people who also making a poem, stories, essays, and more. But Ruan Ji was just a poet and sometimes he is making essays. Ruan Ji wrote lyrical poetry and essays containing veiled criticism and Confucian dogmatism and official corruption, and illustrating the contrast between the ideal and reality. His poems frequently illustrated the contrast between illusory life and the mundaneness of everyday matters, the glory of a hero and solitude of a hermit, the passion of love and the inevitability of separation. One of his famous poems is the poems From My Heart. Ruan Ji's fame rests upon Poems From My Heart, an almanac of 82 pentameter poems written in a unique style. In the first poem of his almanac, Ruan Ji talks about this sad thought. All of his lyrical poetry is tinged with sorrow. He wrote, "Only with sorrow thoughts are occurring. Without sorrow there is no thoughtful mood." Ruanji also left six fu, various essays, and a long prose work, which is the biography of master great men. He took what he thought was most important from the ancient Taoist philosophers, in essence, looking for truth inside himself. The last poet we're going to discuss is Shi Lingyun. Shi Lingyun, also known as the Duke of Kangol, was one of the foremost Chinese poets of the southern and northern dynasties, a member of an aristocratic family associated with the displaced southern court. Shi Lingyun was one of Chinese first nature poets, known for his poems describing mountain and streams landscapes. His poems, composed in the full style of rhyme prose, describe the beautiful mountains, lakes, and rivers of southern China, often expressing a sense of being lost in the landscape. One of his famous poems in Shanjufu, or Fu on Dwelling in the Mountains, where he describes in detail the construction of his home in a setting that would constitute his style and reclusion and poetry, mountains and rivers. His evocative, descriptive poetry set the fashion for his age. In the Wan Husan literary anthology, the 6th century canon that defined medieval Chinese literary tastes, she had more poems than any other 6th Dynasty's poet. Nearly 100 of his poems have survived.